Hello and welcome back to another episode of A Tanker's View with me, your average tanker, Tony. This week we're doing a viewer Q&A because why the heck not? So before we begin with that, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for watching. Really do appreciate it. Also appreciate if you hit that like button, subscribe button, and maybe leave me a comment down below. Leave me a question. Maybe you disagree with one of my answers and you want to argue with me in the comments. Please, by all means, do. Every little bit helps. So, a little bit different. You're seeing a little bit more of my setup. And I've got all the questions here on my phone, along with some notes so I don't ramble on too much. I try to stay on subject. But again, guys, I tend to ramble. You all know this.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
Now, before we begin, I'd like to thank my patrons, Terry Higgins, and my newest patron, Thales Bossel Diaz. I hope I pronounced that right. If I did not, I really do apologize. But again, thanks for supporting the channel, guys. I really do appreciate it. You help produce more content like this, or more content like my other stuff, which you all seem to like a lot better. So with all the housekeeping out of the way, let's just dive right into these questions, shall we? First up is going to be NoBeatAll56, who wrote, what do you think are realistic expectations about the future of tanks on the modern battlefield? So tanks are going to have a long future to come yet in the battlefield. You're always going to need a heavy shock force to break through enemy defenses and cause chaos in the rear. And this has always been the tank's primary role. Now, no one has ever said the tank is invincible. All right. They've all said that tanks are going to be obsolete since World War I when they invented the anti-armor rifle slightly after their introduction. It's just one of those things. They love to say this is going to make this obsolete. It just never really seems to happen. So people have been saying tanks are going to be obsolete ever since the first anti-armor rifle was invented. And then again with anti-tank guided missiles and so on and so forth to the A-10, they're all going to say this is going to be making tanks obsolete. It just never seems to happen, and it's not going to happen anytime in the future. Defensive measures take a lot longer to produce than, say, offensive measures. It's a lot easier to destroy something than it is to keep it from being destroyed. All right, you build a bunker 50 feet underground, we're going to fill an artillery tube full of freaking explosives and just lob that at you at Mach stupid. So if I had to hazard a guess, I'd say you're probably referring to Russia's shit performance in every war they take part in. Well, fortunately, a well-trained army tends to offset a lot of the disadvantages a tank will have as a force multiplier instead of using it as a standalone strike package, which is very vulnerable. Again, like I said, no one's ever said tanks are invincible. And anyone who ever said certain tanks are invincible is lying through their teeth and shouldn't be taken seriously in the slightest. Yes, they're powerful. Yes, they can slug off a lot and keep moving and throw a lot of damage out. But everything has got weak points, and a lot of them. The bigger and more complex a machine, the more weak points it has. And again, it takes a well-trained crew to work around these weak points, to be just one step ahead. But, it always takes just a little bit of luck, and that could be your day that day. I'll give you an example from my own personal experience. When we were in Afghanistan, our biggest primary concern was IEDs. And so I spent just as much time learning the ins and outs of my tank as I did learning how to spot, detect, and avoid IEDs, as not to get my crew or myself killed. Now, coupled with electronic warfare suites and mine implements and other devices like that and tactics, it helps keep you and your friends alive, and that's ultimately what counts. Training is just as important, and certain nations seem to forget that. You can't just throw endless amounts of manpower at a problem. So that institutional knowledge, though, that comes at a very bloody price. Some of my friends have paid that price. But that's why training, coupled with the technology in tanks, will keep you alive. But neither one of those separately. It always takes both components. And if armies remember that, tanks will have a very long and healthy future on the battlefield. All right, so next on here, I had a question about hover tanks, and then a few questions down, I had another question about hover tanks. So I'm going to combine those two actually into a completely separate video because there is just way too much information to toss out about hover tanks to put in a quick little blurb video like this. Like, this is a really deep subject. And I have had a video done already on hover tanks like last year on my old channel, but we're going to redo that and we're going to come back to this. So stay tuned. Next up from Mysticana 6. If I served in World War II, what tank would I prefer to have served in and why? Simple. Sherman Easy-8 or a Firefly. Because one, they're diesel, so they weren't so much prone to catching fire when taking a hit. And two, that nice big German tank killer gun. That 76 millimeter, that long boy, whew, yeah, she fucks. She fucks hard. Alright, so my next question here is from @BodyBreach. What are my thoughts on the M10 Booker and its intent as a direct fire support platform for infantry battalion combat teams? You know what? I think it's a great idea because it means we're returning back to near-peer fighting. And, well, you can't forget your roots. Now, the reason I say that is for the last 20 years, NATO has been focused mostly on counterinsurgency operations. That's great, for after you've already crushed the nation's army, but we are now 2 generations of soldiers removed from what it's like to fight someone with an actual army. And we also lack a lot of that support to do it. You got to remember that the last direct fire support platform that the infantry battalion combat teams had was the M551 Sheridan in Gulf War I, and that thing was generally regarded as the biggest piece of shit in armored vehicle history. Probably even more than the Type 95 Hog-O. But if you really want to know my opinion on the M10 Booker, I absolutely love it. I think it's a great idea. You should check out my video on it. Although in that video I do refer to it as the MPF because it was still not designated the M10 when I made it. But the title still says M10. Alright, my next question after that is from Louis Domingo Calvo Castro 1555. What is my opinion on the Mexican TNSCA Salinas tank? And up to my knowledge is the first ever tank built on the American continent. And you are correct, good sir. It is the first indigenously built tank on the American continent. It looked an awful lot like the British Mark I, except a lot more round and curvy. Let's face it, Latinos love curvy machines. I know I do. Now, to my knowledge, they only ever built one, the prototype. It suffered from all the same problems as the Mark I tank, plus one additional one. They put the egress doors right in front of the machine guns. So if you wanted to go in and out of this thing, you had to stop firing. Not exactly the best idea when it comes to a tank. But you know what? Still, they can claim it was a first, they can claim it proudly, and it goes to show you that mechanical innovation is not solely the purview of the modern Western industrialized nations during that period, or that even other nations were quite capable of the know-how and industrial capacity to build tanks, and we often forget that. So, to Mexico, I salute you. Well done on making the first tank on the American continent. And the next question is from Dominic Smith, 5588. World War I led to massive trench warfare stalemate due to particular historical juncture of military technology at the time, with the machine gun proving such a devastating defensive weapon once that dug in could repel almost any infantry assault. Towards the end of the war, prototype tanks began to introduce and what brought to the end of this stalemate style of warfare. However, Germany was so military, economically, and politically exhausted that they surrendered before they could be implemented on a mass scale to bring about this change. My question is, then, of the limited tank designs that we saw in the use in 1918 before the war ended, which design, in my opinion, was the best in that had they been hypothetically been mass-produced earlier in the war, would have fundamentally changed the course of the war, or in your view, were none of the designed advanced enough that even if mass-produced would have been able to overcome dug-in machine guns? Now, you know what? My absolute position on this is if the French had produced the FT7 right when it had been built and produced it in large enough numbers and completely ignored all that other crap with like the Saint-Chamond and all those other French tanks, the Char B, etc. If they just focused on the FT7 and its two designs with the 57 or the 37 millimeter gun and the one with the machine gun in large enough numbers, that would have been more than enough to absolutely just steamroll the Germans. Because despite all the jokes we throw about at the French really do know how to fight, and they fight hard. They are just hamstrung by their government like every other nation on earth when it comes to their military. And the next one might be more of a video on its own, but what are my own experiences as a tanker? That is definitely a video on its own. But I'll say that a lot of my career was pretty average. I got to do a lot of things I never would have got to do without the Army. I got to see a lot of the world. I got to do a lot of weird shit. It left me with a lot of problems and a lot of trauma. But you know what? Overall, it was probably the most positive experience of my life and the best job I ever had. Everything all considered. And finally, from XC Running Man 95, boxers or briefs? Boxers. I'm not an 11-year-old boy. I don't wear tighty whities. Anyway, guys, that's going to be the question and answer roundup for this time. Thank you again all for watching. If you want your questions answered, please throw them in the comments section down below. Again, thank you all for watching. You're all a huge support. Don't forget to check out my Patreon, like, share, and subscribe. And with that, guys, I will see you all next time. Have a great one.